Channel Ferry disaster. Mrs. Thatcher and the Duke and Duchess of York are at Zeebrugge. 50 bodies are taken from the ship, scores are still missing. The open doors that may be the vital clue, and over 400 count their blessings, they survived. Good evening. 50 bodies have now been brought ashore from the crippled ferry off Zeebrugge. Divers say children and babies are among them. At the moment, the ferry owners, Townsend Torreson, say there are 408 survivors. 97 people are in hospital. 50 are known to be dead, and 94 are still missing. The Belgian authorities say more than 100 are missing. The Duke and Duchess of York have arrived in Zeebrugge to represent the Queen. The Queen said she was shocked and saddened by the terrible disaster. Mrs. Thatcher is also in Zeebrugge. She said it had been a night of anguish. She added that she understood a fundamental design problem was to blame. The shipping minister, Lord Brabazon, says the Herald of Free Enterprise definitely did not hit the harbour wall as first reported. The Belgian naval commander at the scene has also ruled out theories that the ferry's big loading doors were not properly shut. Experts say it's a mystery then how they opened. The Pope has joined the Archbishop of Canterbury in sadness and prayers for the victims. And here, the Labour leader, Mr. Kinnock, and Dr. Owen, the SDP leader, have both said that they were shocked and horrified by the night's events. Mr. Steele, the leader of the Liberal Party, said there must be an inquiry to restore public confidence. And the emergency telephone number is in Maidstone. It's 0622 54321.
Tonight, British and Belgian divers are searching the icy water inside the capsized ferry through holes cut in the hull. The leader of one team said their search was heartbreaking. He said some of his men were in tears. We've just received these pictures from the Herald of Free Enterprise.
By first light today, this 8,000-ton ship looked like a toy, yet she was by now already a grave. Almost flat underneath, whatever happened to her last night, once destabilized, few were surprised she capsized so fast. Useless lifeboats are still perfectly in place along her side. Most of the 400 who escaped clambered out of openings in the ship and up onto the painted white letters of Townsend Torreson on the side. Thereafter, divers tried endlessly to find the rest inside the hull.
There was a lot of activity around the ship, but about a dozen people on board, I suppose, and a lot of bodies on deck. And we started to do a search of the lounge area, which was the most accessible area, but that was mostly flooded, and so we didn't find anyone alive there. And it was just a body job.
Later on in the night, we had a lot of divers on board going inside the ship itself to cover the areas that were missed by the initial search. And at the end of my time on board, I would say that the majority, if not 100%, of the free area above the water was actually searched, apart from the engine room, which was inaccessible. So at the end of my search, chances of survival are nil.
This huge and spontaneous international rescue effort had achieved miracles last night, with Kentish firemen, Dutch divers and Belgian troops working alongside each other as if by second nature. These French airport firefighters were working alongside British divers with American assistance. The mounting death toll, though, as new dead were brought ashore, was received as almost a personal defeat for each of the rescuers. At sea, in search of why the tragedy had happened, we found the ship 1,300 yards from the harbour walls. Prominent, the gaping, now doorless entrance in her bows, known to have played a critical role in her downfall. But local fisherfolk suspected human failure too in calculating tides and securing the doors. The activity is still frenzied at this site. Salvage men standing where last night hundreds of survivors had stood in Arctic cold, waiting for rescue. Last night, This small rescue boat, along with many others, spent the whole night searching for the living. Today, the effort is devoted to trying to retrieve the dead. The authorities have long since given up any hope that anyone is still alive out here. The tugs are now toiling to try to prevent this ship from slipping into the main sea lane and taking the remaining bodies with her. Beyond the exposed propellers too, there are dangerous truckloads in the cargo bay, 50 container trucks of cyanide, 50 of inflammable ethylene spirit. The plan now is to use this giant dredger to dig a pit for her to fall upright into, and then, having sorted her cargo, to float her off for scrap. Though she may be got rid of, the serious questions that the disaster of her sinking poses may take far longer to resolve. John Snow, ITN, off Zeebrugge in Belgium.
The captain of the Herald of Free Enterprise said his ship went down in less than a minute. Captain David Lurie from Kent is in hospital tonight with chest injuries. He said he'd heard a crash, then his ferry began to sink. He had no time to send an SOS.
Dawn this morning brought the first clear pictures of the sunken car ferry, her port side resting on the seabed, more than 100 people still trapped inside the hull. Before first light, divers had given up all realistic hope of finding any alive. Their colleagues who had swum right through the wreck said there was no sign of life. At around 6:45 last night, this massive vessel had filled with water and keeled over before it could even send a distress signal. On board, passengers spoke of panic and fighting in their struggle to get out through the few open exits. Helicopters were overhead within minutes. For some, they'd arrived just in time. For others, it was clearly too late. Hundreds of blankets were issued to keep survivors warm. This one had a more depressing purpose. Every available ambulance and medical team, military and civilian, stood by to carry the injured to hospital. With priority given to the seriously ill, the dead waited their turn at the quayside.
Philip?
70 of the most fortunate arrived in one boatload. Deeply shocked, they were still able to walk as they held each other in sheer relief. But for some, it was the beginning of a long and agonizing wait to hear news of relatives or friends. Many couples and families had been separated in the darkness. Back on the wreck, the rescuers worked on, beside a lifeboat hanging uselessly on its side.
We went down in the ship, and it's incredible to see what happened. People were drowning in the ice-cold water. We tried to get them out. It's a terrible thing. It's very hard to describe. You have to see it. It's terrible. We were able to rescue a few of them, but quite a lot even. But on the other hand, it was too late for a lot of other people.
How many deaths do you think there will be?
Well, it's very hard to say, but when I left inside the ship, about 20 or 25 people were just around me. They were all dead. And we tried to get them out as soon as possible, but they were dead already.
But people were still being rescued alive. By happy chance, NATO warships were exercising in the area and came quickly to give assistance. In the early hours of the morning, the last 3 survivors were found and winched to safety. They'd survived in an air pocket inside the freezing hull for more than 8 hours. But no more were found. On the quayside, the Belgian Prime Minister encouraged the rescue efforts. Soon after him, the King and Queen of Belgium on their way to visit survivors. By that time, any who had survived were already in hospital. After so many hours of bitterly cold weather, the rescuers at sea had given up any realistic hope. James Mates, ITN, Zeebrugge.
A British Caledonian jet is on its way to Ostend to bring up to 230 of the survivors back to Britain. They'll arrive at Gatwick Airport later tonight. Nearly 100 survivors are recovering in hospitals near Zeebrugge. A 4-month-old baby girl is in intensive care with a fractured skull. And doctors have saved the life of a 14-year-old girl who suffered a heart attack in the extreme cold. Her temperature had fallen more than 10 degrees below normal. One passenger who was in a wheelchair said fighting broke out when the ferry began to sink.
The fleets of ambulances took the injured to 6 hospitals. Most of the survivors were suffering from severe hypothermia and shock. Many had heart attacks because of the extreme cold. Wards were filled with people plucked from the torrents of icy water. Many were recounting stories of remarkable escapes. Others talked of tragedy.
It just went. I mean, it really just tipped, and I could feel us getting further and further over, and people were starting to have to hold on to stop themselves being thrown against the side, and then everything came off the tables and there was glass flying everywhere.
Did you help anybody, Free?
Yeah, I wanted to, because there's about 12 drivers in the restaurant, and we all helped each other like, because it was upside down. We ended up having to smash glass once we got up, but I climbed up to the top and somebody stood on me and I went back down to the bottom again.
But you still managed to get back up again?
Yeah, that's when I thought, here comes the end. Yeah.
You didn't expect to get out alive?
No, certainly not at first, no. It just happened so quickly and the water came so quickly.
The thing started sliding and then the water started coming past the window down the bottom, so I thought, you know.
How long did all this take?
About 40 seconds from its beginning to us being on our sides, lights out. And I just managed to grab the baby and we fell down to the other side of the boat. And people were falling on top of me and all this.
It was your baby, was it?
Yeah, and we managed to get him out, passed him up to other people that were hanging onto the tables and everything else. And when they finally got to us and they smashed the windows open, we all got out eventually. But of course, been hanging on that long, my arms were getting a bit numb.
What about the baby?
He was all right. Yeah, he was all right.
Alan Davis thought he'd lost his wife until a few hours ago. What was it like to get the news then?
The news this morning was wonderful news. I must be quite honest. It's the best bit of news I've ever had in my life, actually.
What did you think had happened? What did you fear?
Well, what happened was that I knew my 2 children had got out safely through the top, and I saw my wife above me, and the next thing I knew, somebody fell down, and I wasn't aware of the fact that she'd got out. I thought maybe she had slipped and fallen. But
what was it like during all that chaos?
Terrible. That's all I can say. It was terrible, especially for the children and the mothers. It was absolutely awful.
Physical strength was needed to actually get up the ladders.
Yes, it was.
Push through all the water.
Especially the children had the greatest difficulty in getting up. That was the main problem with it.
What about yourself? What did you do?
Well, I'm not too bad, actually. I had a few injuries, and I just stayed on the bottom until I could actually get on the ladder to get up.
What was it like actually losing your wife and not actually seeing her, not knowing where she was?
Well, last night it was very, very difficult for me to sleep, basically, worrying about my wife and where my children were. But I got the news this morning that they're okay, so, you know, it's all turned out quite well for me, actually.
The Duke and Duchess of York are now in Zeebrugge to represent the Queen, and Mrs. Thatcher, who cancelled all her engagements for today, has flown over the capsized ferry and has also been to the bedsides of some of those recovering from their ordeal. We've just received this report from Zeebrugge.
The Duke and Duchess of York arrived by Sea King helicopter at the Belgian naval dockyard where the disaster centre has been set up. The Duchess of York looked visibly moved as she was introduced to Belgian port officials and rescue workers. Prince Andrew, a helicopter pilot himself, talked to officers and discussed the air rescue operation in detail, apparently inquiring how people were plucked from the icy waters. The couple met divers who formed part of the massive Belgian, Dutch and British rescue operation. They then left for a series of private visits to hospitals. Earlier, Mrs. Thatcher arrived in a Royal Navy Sea King after overflying the disaster area and viewing the crippled ship at close hand. After landing, she immediately called a joint press conference with Belgian Prime Minister Wilfred Martus.
I am extremely grateful that the Governor and all the other responsible people for, in these tragic hours, did such a wonderful job.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, may I add a few words? It has been a night of anguish for everyone. It has also been a night of great courage and a night of great professionalism and concern on the part of all of the rescue services. On behalf of all of the citizens of the country which I represent, I want to say thank you to the Government of Belgium, to the Governor of the province, to your Minister of Transport, to all of your rescue services for the wonderful work which they did. And I understand, had they not been so courageous and so expert and there so quickly, many, many more lives would have been lost because the waters were so cold.
The Prime Minister then departed for her hospital visits, looking first at the Blankenberg Hospital, where a short time ago she met the Fisher family, nearly split apart by the disaster.
You were separated from the little girl.
We left her with friends while we went to the duty-free shop. And while we were in there, the sort of floor started moving.
And then she was down the back end, and we were halfway along the boat to the port side in the duty-free shop.
And then bottles started rattling, and then the odd bottle fell off of the cradles that they were in.
You must have been terrified when you...
Well, we didn't really know what was happening to start with.
We were just trying to hold on to stable things, because
we were
going
everything
to be
just went
pushed
all at once,
towards the starboard side of the ship.
What about poor Lisa?
We didn't know what had happened to her, and we didn't have a chance to find out, because once everything had happened, I disappeared apparently. I slipped across the duty-free shop as everything collapsed.
Yeah.
Mrs. Thatcher planned to see at least 4 hospitals this evening before holding a further news conference. Andrew Simmons, ITN, Zeebrugge.
I'm sorry we had some sound interference on that report just in from Zeebrugge. After the break, the question which still confronts the experts: what caused disaster to strike with such deadly speed? A report next. Plus the families waiting and hoping. That's in a minute.
Looking after your teeth and gums properly requires professional help and advice. Regular checkups are obviously important, but the rest of the time, we need to continue the good work the dentist has done. Brushing with an Oral-B will help see to that. Its special filaments have been carefully designed to be gentle on your gums, yet tough enough to remove plaque effectively. If your dentist cares about keeping your teeth and gums healthy, shouldn't you? People who care about their teeth use Oral-B.
If you had the chance, wouldn't you change your life? Take up the challenge tomorrow. Life Plan in the Sunday Times. The unique 100-day program that challenges you to look better, feel better, be happier, even more successful. Life Plan could help you become the person you'd like to be. Life Plan, a 100-day challenge that could change your life. Starting tomorrow. Created exclusively for readers of the Sunday Times.
Nearly 24 hours after the disaster, there's still mystery over its cause. The port authorities at Zeebrugge say the Herald did not hit the pier as it left the harbour. Mrs Thatcher said tonight she understood a fundamental design problem was to blame. Pictures of the stricken vessel after the accident show the bow doors open, but the naval commander in charge of the rescue says the accident wasn't caused because the doors weren't properly closed. For any ferry to put to sea, first the car ramp should be withdrawn, all the ropes should be cleared and the doors closed. Ideally, all three precautions ought to be taken before the ferry leaves the quayside. They must be taken within the next 30 seconds.
The grief and sadness, the horror that lies within a barren steel shell, a nightmare come true, but one that surprises few shipping experts who thought that because in theory it could happen, then one day it would. In the midst of the anguish, two simple questions: how and why? These fast turnaround, roll-on, roll-off ferries are regarded as vulnerable by marine experts. Unlike passenger liners, they have no flooding control compartments below or on the waterline. There's just a vast open space as big as a football field. These pictures of the Herald were taken recently and show conditions on board very much as they would have been last night. Ro-ros, as they called, have two sets of doors at either end. Inner doors, which are shut first, and then the enormous bow and stern sections which completely seal off the lower decks. One rescue worker said this morning that the doors used for loading last night were still open as the ferry turned to sea. From these pictures it looks as though the main doors are not closed. A suggestion that the ship collided with a seawall has now been dismissed by the port authorities. Any inquiry will demand to know precise details of the ferry's operation, from the time it docked in Zeebrugge up to the point of the accident. The loading of the ship is supervised by the chief officer. Part of his job is to make sure the ship is trim for the voyage, that the weight of lorries and cars is equally distributed. The traditional way of doing this is by checking the draft marks at either end of the vessel. The draft levels should be entered in the captain's log. If the loading's uneven, leaving the bow section low, trimming can take place by pumping seawater ballast into special tanks. It's possible that this manoeuvre could take place while the vessel gets underway, and salvage experts will want to look at the valve system. If the bow doors were open as the ferry turned seawards, one marine consultant said today that he would regard the ship as being unready for sea. It's not clear, though, how the water came in, because the sill of the door should be well above the waterline. But in the event it did come in, gushing and forcing a rolling, destabilizing motion. The ship rolled to port, then to starboard, and finally back to port, and this time, unable to recover, she went right over. It took just 10 seconds. 14 months ago, the Royal National Lifeboat Institution demonstrated some of the problems posed by the new breed of ferries. They staged a test evacuation of passengers using a Sally Line ferry. British companies had refused to take part. The RNLI found that there were areas of concern when it came to clearing passengers off the ship, even in favourable conditions.
Townsend Torreson officials in Dover have admitted that people in Britain who want to know whether members of their families are safe are experiencing delays. Many people are travelling to Zeebrugge to find out for themselves.
For those relatives who spent the night at Dover, the terrible frustration of waiting to know. 16-year-old Rebecca Eade from Surrey wanted to find out about both her parents and 8 friends on a day trip. Then at last, mixed news.
Mum's in hospital, but they haven't got any news on my dad.
An hour later, still no firm news of her father. Hope was shading into despair. Beside her, Richard Jordan telephoned repeatedly for news of his father-in-law, a cook on board the stricken ferryboat.
They've all got lists, but he ain't on the list, so he must still be trapped or missing. We don't know. I ain't got a clue.
Meanwhile, Rebecca Eade had heard her father was safe.
You must be very happy.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, I am.
At Townsend Torreson's headquarters, the flags flew at half-mast. Staff spent all night and all day updating information on the ferry's own crew members and passing it on to their relatives. But still, Richard Jordan and other crew relatives had no news, along with many of the passengers' relatives who'd also gathered there, some to be counselled by the Salvation Army. Some found it harder and harder to control their frustration, but Townsend Torreson insisted they were doing their best.
Well, obviously, I think we all are a little frustrated because
As we mentioned earlier, the search and all the operation has been coordinated by the Belgian authorities, and it appears that the information coming through from Belgium has been a little slow.
As internal company inquiries continued into how the tragedy could possibly have happened, the shipping minister visited the headquarters and declared his faith in Townsend Torres.
That I'd go on and travel. I'd go on one of those ferries myself this afternoon if I wanted to get across. You mustn't forget there are something like 250 cross-channel ferries a day, and they have a very, very good safety record. But of course we will be wanting to find out as soon as possible what might have caused this accident, and if steps need to be taken, we'll have to take them.
But within the past 2 hours, more relatives were on their way by hydrofoil to visit injured survivors and identify the dead. Charles Hodgson, ITN, Dover.
A brief look at the rest of the news. Miners in South Wales have agreed to work 6 days in a row at the new Margam super pit in West Glamorgan. The mine will create 800 new jobs. The Conservative Party chairman, Mr Tebbit, has again attacked what he calls Labour's loony left local councils. He said they were the agents of socialism in schools, in housing and in employment. Police officers in Wolverhampton have been pelted with wooden staves and snowballs during a protest over the death of Mr Clinton McKerbin, the man who died while being arrested last month.